Welcome to the Independent Producers Organization program. This is the program that showcases independent producers, their productions, and provides a forum for discussing issues which affect independent television producers here in the Pacific Northwest.
Got it.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Welcome to the Independent Producers Organization Live Showcase. We're going to live showcase for about half the program, and including some phone calls, we hope, talking about Portland livability or its lack thereof. It used to be a small city with a lot of charm and a lot of livability for folks, and now it's just a race to the bottom as a few people are racing to the top. And it's unfortunate it has to be that way. And we're here with Karen Crichton with Stop Demolishing Portland, and also we have Richard Carpenter over here on my far right, who's another producer here as well, scribbling feverishly over here. He must have something good going on. But anyway, Karen, I had Karen come on my program, The Growing Concern, which airs live every Friday night at 7 o'clock on Channel 11. And we had a good conversation. I thought we should do that again. And there's a lot to talk about. Obviously, Stop Demolishing Portland is just one aspect of what is going on with the problems here in Portland. People are being run out in order for the people having their rent bumped up very high in order to either demolish the places or move in tenants that'll pay more. There's a lot of aspects about this. And we're gonna start off with Karen, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for
All
having
right.
me back. I appreciate it.
Any place you want to start?
Okay. Well, I guess that would be an important aspect. Just the demolitions period. That is, I suppose some people think that's sort of a thing where we're only concerned about the lovely, big, historical, stately mansions, but that's not the case at all. Of course, those are lovely, but a lot of the older houses are also a city's affordable housing stock. Mm-hmm. And that's being demolished now and being replaced with very large, very expensive houses.
Are they sacrificing a single family dwelling in order to build dwellings that hold more people, or is it just a McMansion being put in with only with one family? I mean, if you're just demolishing something for a one-family home, and you end up with another house with just one family. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of these older homes have been refitted for duplex and quadruplexes, mm-hmm. and so they're bumping a lot of people out.
Exactly, and actually we do have a mandate for Metro that all cities in Metro are supposed to be striving to increase their housing density. We're supposed to be preparing for the climate refugees and that sort of thing, and preparing for growth. But yeah, we're seeing too many of these houses, the ones especially in the single family home neighborhoods, where there's a lot of the great old, we think of those as like the Portland neighborhoods, Portland houses, the craftsman style cottages with the
little gingerbread up in the corners.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a nice big basement. They have yards and gardens and old trees. Mm-hmm. And now you've got developers coming in and being allowed to just annihilate everything on that property.
Allowed, hell, or encouraged, it seems like.
They are. They actually are. Yeah. It's up to the city. A lot of people want to be mad at the developers, and I get that, and I feel that too sometimes. But where we should be directing our anger is it's up to our elected officials, whether you're in the city or unincorporated county, wherever you are. It's up to those elected officials to put some limits on those developers. This is what developers do. They tear things down and build new things. That's what they do.
Before they do that is they go to city council, and I don't know how they guess do campaign contributions. As you mentioned, it is the builders, but we have a very compliant and affable city council.
Yes, much too much so.
You said something about climate refugees.
I was going to ask that myself. He caught that too.
Yeah.
That came from Steve Novick.
Steve Novak.
Yeah,
Okay,
he
well.
said that we have to prepare. In one of his little outbursts one time, he said that we have to all prepare for these climate refugees that are going to come up here, supposedly because we still have this reputation that we get all this rain and we have an abundance of water. California's drying up, so
Arizona, Nevada, New
right.
Mexico.
Exactly.
I think we have the best climate in the country. After
We
seeing
do.
all the other storms and the rains and the
108 in LA the other day. I couldn't
Yeah,
believe it.
they're having brownouts from the heat in Southern California right now.
Man.
And we do not have the water anymore. I don't, frankly, I follow the water issues a lot, as we've talked
Right.
about, and we're into just the first year of serious drought. California's into their fourth year of
Right.
ongoing serious drought. This requires a lot of water to just construction period requires a lot of water, and we're building new houses, and it's not all just single family houses. A great example is a property that we had protested on Hawthorne.
Oh, yeah.
At 32nd and
I
Hawthorne.
think it was
There's this-
35th, but 34th, but
somewhere in there.
somewhere in there, yeah.
There's this
Really?
gorgeous big white house that had years ago been split up into a fourplex. It's there in the business district, but it was split into 4 apartments. Very affordable rents for
Hawthorne,
that
that's
area.
saying a lot.
That is saying a whole lot. And the people that had lived there, I understand, had lived there for quite a long time. And that's we had demonstrated there in August when we found out that was going to be demolished and replaced with a 4-story apartment building with no parking built for it.
I can't
on
get over that.
Hawthorne.
You can't
Yeah.
park on Hawthorne as it is during their busy times.
You can't.
Which therefore you shouldn't make it worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we talk about stop demolishing Portland, and it's important to keep that in mind, but how can we really stop it?
Well, that is a
Isn't that-
discussion we need to be having, frankly.
With the city council.
Yeah, yeah.
mean,
and the bigger picture with, remember ZPG, zero population
growth, yep.
right? I mean, we need to be having those conversations.
How do you have a
again.
conversation with these 5 guys sitting up there
And one girl.
and you come
Yeah.
down to the microphone
And they give you 2 minutes.
and
Yeah.
and you can't hear from them? So how do
They
you
might
have
ask you questions in between yawns.
well,
but-
okay.
Yeah, that's a good point, and you're not going to make any headway just by making your 2-minute comment. I mean, there has to be other things going on, and apparently there's something going on, or some kind of pressure being felt, even though a lot of people think it's not really sincere, but they're putting a few million bucks into the homeless. So they didn't do that because they did it of their own heart. They must have been feeling pressure for a while.
A lot of pressure. That's where this new quote unquote demolition tax came from. I haven't had time to, I think there's people out there that know more than I do about that one right now, because they had a city council meeting today where they talked about
Yeah, Wednesday.
Yes, the $25,000 demolition tax that has already turned into having enough loopholes that a developer could drive a dump truck through it. So it's not going to do. This is election season posturing. Ted Wheeler has announced that he's going to run against Hales, and he's going to give him a run for his money.
Yeah.
And so Hales is now just now starting to respond to things like the rapid increase in homelessness, the due to the housing crisis and the demolitions, and I mean, this is just election posturing. This is not anything real.
Homelessness. We're being buffered by Los Angeles saying we're going to do something about homelessness, and then Seattle they're going to do something, San Francisco. So we're saying, well, what are we going to do? That's kind of our position. That's the way it seems to me.
Exactly, and even Vancouver recently said they're going to start allowing camping. They're not going to.
Is that BC or?
No, right
the
across the
river?
river here.
Yeah.
And Portland there's people fighting just to keep a few campers on some property. I don't know if you've heard, there's a camp at where Greeley and Interstate come together. And,
Oh yeah.
yeah. It's like patchwork of ODOT land, city land. It's The land ownership is a little complicated.
A little bit of Dignity Village going on.
Well,
there.
that's what the people they're trying to set up. There's college students living there. What has our country come to? We have college students living in homeless camps so they can just try to finish their schooling.
Because they can't afford the rents.
Yes.
College students are famous for a few of them renting a house, and 3 or 4
right.
bedroom house. I was just talking to someone the other day. It wasn't a college student, but he said 5 or 6 bedroom house, $2,800. That means each one of them's going to have $500 or $600, and that's the only way that's possible. But those are becoming fewer and far between.
Those days are frankly over. We started hearing from people about that situation months ago. People who that's been sort of a tradition in Portland. People getting together, getting one of the big older houses, and splitting them up the best they can into separate living spaces and sharing.
Yeah.
And it's a nice sense of community for people who
Sure.
would live alone otherwise. But it also created affordable housing for people who couldn't afford their own apartment or give the deposits or whatever.
You maximize your use of resources too, because you have a house there, and you have each one of them people or 2 people living in a separate house. They use a larger amount of electricity relative to 5 or 6 of them living together, and the cooking, they can all cook together, and it's like the word is community, and if you got a wife and a kid, or husband and a kid or whatever, you might want to have your own individual residence. But those are the folks that are having the hardest time of it. I mean, just off the top of my head, a man and a woman, they have a child, and they have to go back to work almost immediately, and babysitters cost almost as much as they're making. I mean, everything is I really feel bad for people who are just starting out in life.
Young families, they have no chance of buying a house anywhere near the city right now with the way things are. And frankly, even more at risk, in my opinion, than these young. I mean, it's terrible for anybody who's just working class trying to just find a suitable place to live. But people on fixed incomes, on Social Security, the average Social Security retirement check in this country is $1,300 a month. Well, we're seeing apartments where we're not hearing about anything under $1,000 for a studio.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky, and if you can even get into one, So I would like to hear from people out there. Our website and our Facebook page are Stop Demolishing Portland. If you know of seniors, people with disabilities that are landing in homeless camps, that are losing their housing, I'd like to hear about that and see if we can do some work on that issue too.
Yeah, because as you mentioned, the elderly, they're generally, if they have Medicare or whatever, that helps a lot. But there's also medications and things that you have to choose between food, medication, and housing.
Absolutely.
And now I don't know. Well, medication generally comes down last, although it should be first. But I don't know. And this issue is so much larger than just the demolishing of the homes. But that is the most, the one that grabs your most attention when you drive through the neighborhood I used to live into over on Harold. I went through there the other day, and there was 3 or 4 of them big, what do they call them, pencil houses or whatever, thrown together with spit and glue. It seems like, and they were single family dwellings. And there might have been 2 of them. There's a spot over there across from Fred Meyer there in Southeast Portland, where there was a big house, and I guess, I don't know, it was used as a commercial a lot. And they ended up putting 5 houses in that. They were about 50 feet tall and about 20 feet wide, but they got 5 houses in there, and it's ugly. It kind of reminds me of pictures I've seen of China or Russia, the gulags or whatever, and Portland's starting to look like a hive. I was driving up. What was it, Williams, and they're just building these enormous structures everywhere, and it looks like it looks like a hives, They're just like little cubicles for bees, and Portland Hive now. It's not Portland, Oregon.
And they're building apartment buildings that don't have any bathrooms. I mean,
They share bathrooms.
Yeah,
well, that goes
share
over
bathrooms,
well.
share kitchens. Yeah. And the rent is as expensive as you used to get a full-blown apartment for.
I didn't know they were doing that.
Oh, there's several of those.
really?
To me, that's quite insulting for people to not at least have their own restroom,
Yeah.
facilities to use, let alone to cook and bathe.
I think cooking and bathing should be a leisurely thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I sure would hope so, unless you get up late or whatever. But at the same time, that is terrible. And this whole situation of it's all in the hands of property managers now. And I'm sure they take a cut right off the top. I was told the other day how that operates. I don't recall offhand. Maybe it'll come to me. But somebody puts their properties into a property manager, and right off the bat, it's bumping it up. And the property managers demand you have to prove income of 3 times the amount of the rent.
Yes.
How the hell are people going to do
Yeah.
that?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a new one.
$1,500 is
Yeah.
$4,500 a month rent that you got to prove that you're making. That's a lot of, maybe people make that kind of money in San Francisco considering the cost of living down there, but that puts a lot of people out. I know people right now that are having to move in with relatives and stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah. We had an ad somebody had shared on one of our pages that was an ad for you could rent a bunk bed in San Francisco in an apartment. Yeah, and it was like over $1,000 a month.
Probably for 8 hours a day, and someone else
Yeah,
is having
right. Right, like that old movie.
Yeah, well, like the old movies are like I think that's what they did in some of these they call it the fruit pickers in California.
Right.
They'd bring the Mexicans in there or the Latino, whatever country they were from, and they'd rent the room, the bed for 8 hours, and then go to work.
Right.
And
right.
that's during the harvest season,
Yeah.
sure. But that is an intense situation where they have a certain amount of time to get the work done, and the people need the money, but that intensity is also in a different way is happening here now.
Yes. Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at like along Division Street, they're building
Yeah,
numerous apartment
that's right.
buildings. They've torn down single.
There's no Max train there.
No.
Nothing but just an old
Never
bus.
thought of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just that one bus.
But they are creating a high capacity bus. What's the term for a straight through express type
Express?
bus?
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
from out in East Portland, because the people who need to work in these businesses, so they may serve the people who live in this expensive housing, they have to live way out in East County now. So they're being provided with a high capacity bus or an express bus. So they're allowed to come into the city to work to serve. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I know I have to travel through Division, and I just watched it just explode, and
Yes.
it's actually starting to move out towards 52nd now, east of 39th. And I know folks out there that don't live in that part of town, you might have your own story to tell about Northeast Portland, as I mentioned, Williams and Vancouver.
Right.
The only thing I got good to say about that is just a steady stream of bicycles going up and down those streets, because a lot of people up there are using bicycle transportation. I've read that like 5,000 people a day to go down through downtown in order to go to work, and that's the good side of Portland. But we're talking about the bad side, and everybody has stories. I encourage folks to want to call up, and we can put up a number. What is it? At 20 after. And we pretty much open-ended on this. We're just going to play some videos later because I wasn't able to organize more people to come in and talk on this. Part of it's my fault, and part of it is it's just people are busy. Some folks are having meetings, and they're dealing with the issues they're dealing with, and it happens to be Wednesday night. We'll get at them another time. And we didn't quite get Marie from what is it? The Tenants Priced Out. And if people want to go to that Tenants Priced Out website, she's just put up some videos. She mentioned the Wednesday meeting too. I don't know if it was this one. And she interviewed an elderly woman who was having some issues that I think this one was not a poor person, but still, even with women that have, or people that have some modest means anyway, they're having issues too. It isn't just poor people. It isn't just people that are on limited income. It isn't just poor people. It isn't just people that are ill and have issues with health. It's like we mentioned, it's people just starting out, and we're sitting there and make a lot of complaints, And what are all these complaints directed to? They're directed to city council. And if we can't conduct ourselves and talk to one another and get together with some of these organizations, I've mentioned 2 organizations. What are some of the other organizations that are involved in this, different aspects of it?
I like the Community Alliance of Tenants.
They're very
I think his
good.
name is Justin Burry.
They're pretty much a mainstream organization.
They've been around for some years now.
Community Alliance
Yeah.
of Tenants?
He's been working on that for a long time now, and he was already very familiar and tracking a lot of things. This is a lot of my complaint too, frankly, that now all of a sudden we have these various nonprofits, what I like to refer to as the affordable housing industry, that is now all of a sudden they have this movement to increase the tax increment financing in Portland to help pay for more affordable housing. Why are we only doing this now? I mean, anybody who tracks housing, this is what city planners are supposed to be tracking, is, here's how the population is going to change. We're going to need housing for these people, so let's start building it now so we'll be ready for when the city grows in the future.
Sure.
How could any of these people who work in housing and everybody in the city, how could they possibly have been caught by surprise by any of this?
Well,
they're not builders, remember. It's the builders that are the builders.
right.
And these people that work down in the planning commission, that's all they do.
they're not doing their job.
They're not.
They're being elected or they're being paid to exercise foresight, not hindsight. You can pay somebody $10 an hour to exercise hindsight. It's, oh yeah, we got a problem now.
Yeah.
Oh well, yeah, that's not what they're being paid for, and that's not what they're being elected to do, in my mind.
Yeah.
Because the people have a job and they work and they got kids, or they're busy in their lives. They don't have time to keep their finger on the pulse of what's going on the undercurrent. Because this problem's been building for a while. I don't know if it was you or somebody was telling me, it might have been Murray, that through the last 20 years or so, people were buying and selling their homes, and they were raising their kids and they were making money, and there was builders doing it too, of course. But just a regular everyday person would buy a home and fix it up and sell it, and they were all building towards what's happening now by pumping all the prices up. And so it's just like with most of the problems in this country. It's everybody kind of might have, not everybody, but many people were involved in this along the way by not paying attention.
Or by not sharing what they knew.
Sure,
And in fact, I've been reading recently more and more about the houses. There was millions. I don't remember the exact number, but there was millions of houses that were foreclosed on after our economy crashed a few years ago. And there was always a lot of talk about, why are these houses sitting vacant? Why aren't the cities buying them, getting people into housing with those? Well, I've been reading recently. There's this new industry building, the rental home industry. There's groups of investors, private equity groups, and Blackstone, different organizations
from out of the state, probably a lot of them.
National companies,
Yeah.
yes, and they've bought up huge blocks of not city blocks, but like packaging, of houses.
Like the loans were
that-
packaged.
That's exactly it, and a lot of these are those foreclosed houses. They bought them from the banks,
Right.
and they've been sitting on them until things picked up, and now they've been just fixing them up a little bit and renting them out. And I mean, just imagine if your landlord was a private equity firm. Are you ever going to get your toilet fixed?
And they probably use a property manager.
Yeah.
Unless they are themselves. So there's just another level of bumping things up between you and the people that own the house. If it's a landlord, you can call a landlord and talk to him, but you can't really talk to a property manager, let alone what do you call an equity?
Private equity
Private
firms.
equity. Yeah, you can't talk to those
They don't.
folks.
That's some person who's never going to know who you
Sure.
are or even know where your house is.
Might as well.
They're just invested. They just invested in a portfolio that.
Might as well try to call up Mitt Romney, huh?
Yeah.
I'm not picking on Republicans there. He just happens to be
Go ahead.
the only person like that I know. Person that's on that level that Trump, I guess, is another
Yeah.
one, and he's not a Republican. But But yeah, that big money. I mean, they've got, and a lot of ways. In some ways, they've earned that. But a lot of the money they earned, they've kept a lot more of it than the average person.
Yes.
Which billionaire was it that paid less taxes than his secretary? I forget which
Oh,
one.
Warren Buffett.
Warren
yeah.
Buffett.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So they exercise those loopholes, and they have the lawyers that help to form the tax code. And just like the builders and the contractors, mainly I think would go. Now that I mention them, I think in Salem, what was it, in the 50s or the 60s or something like that? There was laws that you could only bump your rent up $60 a year, or there was
I
rules.
remember that. Yes.
And I don't think
Really?
it was the city. I don't think it was the congressman that came up with that idea to get rid of that on their own. They had to been, we'll call it nudged. Well, they might have been nudged in that direction. That now there's no limit what they can do.
Right. That's one thing that the Community Alliance of Tenants, and other groups, they've all been speaking about that. We're hearing from people who their rent goes up $400 in one, or from 1 month to the next. Nobody can plan for that or be prepared for that.
And if you have to pay it for a couple, 3 months till you find another place, you won't have any money to find another place.
Exactly, and the council again is allegedly trying to get some renters protections in place, but to me all they are is they're just going to postpone the inevitable, because all they're doing, the last I read about that, Saltzman was proposing to extend the period. If you get an eviction, that you have like 90 days instead of 30 or 60, and then a longer period of time for another aspect. I'm sorry. But the reality is there's not going to be any more housing in another 30 days than there was a month ago, and rents are just going to go up even more. So you've just got to come up with even more money the longer you wait.
That's
to go
not
find
even
a new place.
that's not even a Band-Aid.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. It's insulting, frankly, to all the renters who are just panicking right now about becoming homeless.
I'm convinced they're trying to build and keep up with it. I see an awful lot of units constructed, and
Those are
somebody's
expensive.
doing something.
But those big fancy Cracker Jack boxes they're building are going to be
Yeah.
expensive.
Those are so-called market rate apartments. They will charge whatever rent the market will bear, and
Yeah,
the
that's true.
city is not going to put any limits on any of it.
They're moving up towards what, $1,200 for a single bedroom?
Oh, at
apartment,
least.
something like
oh,
that.
yeah, studios we're seeing for that much. Yeah.
In San Francisco, it's what, 2,800,
Oh.
3,000.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And we're heading in that direction. And it happened incrementally in San Francisco and LA and Boston and these places, but it's happening faster here, and it'll happen faster, in another area. Things like that escalate as it goes down through time. It happens quicker. Of course, a lot of that's because people down there are coming up here.
Yeah.
But we won't talk about Californicating. I can remember that term when I moved up here in the early '70s.
Yeah. The Chili Peppers didn't make that up.
And there is a certain amount of truth in that, whether they're coming from a big city in California or in the upper Midwest or in Chicago or whatever. People realize, oh man, they can come out here and live for half as much as they were living back there, and if they want to retire or whatever. And then throw on top of that this whole climate thing. I've read somewhere that by 2050 they expect our population in Oregon to triple.
Oh, yeah.
But, Metro, if you look at Metro's population forecast, they're saying that a lot of those people that will be moving here over the next 10 years, whatever, they're going to have lower than average incomes. So where are they going to live if the lower income people, working class people
Wow.
that are already here can't find a place to live? This whole, the system that we have for providing housing for the people who live in this area is just utterly and completely broken. And
It's incompetent.
yeah, it's totally, and it's corrupt, frankly. The state legislature, the cities are blocked at the state level from building from requiring a developer to include affordable housing in a new housing development, a new apartment building or a subdivision or something. It's called inclusionary zoning, and it's always traditionally been an option the city can do.
Other cities do that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Like
That's
Seattle,
traditionally.
maybe?
Yeah. When you see an apartment building, that's part of it is some portion is truly affordable housing within the federal guidelines for affordable.
For that
That came
standard
from-
of living for that city.
Exactly, yeah, for the income and that can't happen because the Home Builders Association does their lobbying at the state capitol. They seem to have quite a bit of influence compared to the rest of us, and they got a ban put in place on inclusionary zoning in the state. So no city is allowed now to require a developer to build affordable housing. We haven't built any in years.
What reason did they give? Do you have any idea how they sold that, other than
'Cause they don't make enough
other than the
money
greenback
building.
dollar?
They don't make enough money building affordable housing. They don't. Yeah.
How much money do they need?
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand, you're in business to make a buck, but we're also part of a community here that they say we're all in this together. Well, apparently we're not. There's those that aren't in this with us, and they continue to exclude themselves from living on basically the same planet as the rest of us. So I don't know. It's I just recently watching a science fiction where everybody that was living down on the Earth, they were poor and all beat to hell, and the Earth was dilapidated, and everybody that had money and lived well lived up on some space place in the sky. Elysium was the name of it.
Oh.
And it was Matt Damon, good actor. It was a typical shoot 'em up type show, but that isn't so far-fetched science fiction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe not necessarily in a space station in space,
Yeah.
but there will be that losing the middle class, like Bernie says, and everything is moving towards the poor, more towards the poor, and the people towards the rich. It was it John, the guy that got caught running around with another woman when he was right after he was running for president.
Oh, John Edwards.
John Edwards. He talked about two Americas.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Well, he hit the nail on the head.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And it's becoming, it's always that way. There's the rich and the poor, but if the middle class is being squeezed out, which is think what you think of, think what you will of Bernie Sanders and socialism, but he makes a lot of good points.
Well, and I have these discussions occasionally out in the burbs. We do have our share of Tea Party conservative type people, and we have this discussion over, so why should my government or why should my tax dollars help to pay for somebody who can't afford their own housing? Well, my response to that always is that I think we've all decided as a society in America that we don't want to see grandma laying on the sidewalk selling pencils so she can eat dinner that night. We want her a safety net here to catch her before that happens.
You're dying on a sidewalk or a bench 5 blocks from the White House, which has happened.
Exactly.
And
yes. That is shameful.
what did you say? The average Social Security is $1,300.
Yeah.
Yeah, for retirement, and for disability it's even less. And there's a myth out there that somebody who's disabled or really poor, well, just taking people with disabilities, that there's still people that believe that there's agencies that can put them into housing. That's been done years ago, frankly. You can go on a waiting list. You might get onto a waiting list, but even the waiting lists are full at this point, and they can't even put you on a waiting list anymore.
There's no houses and there's no room on the waiting list.
Yeah, and
nothing left.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's no new affordable housing being built. Our population is increasing. Our population is aging.
Was that Section 8? Or does that go way back too far?
Section 8 is a federal program. It's still around, but
Okay.
it's really hard. There's people, we hear stories quite a bit that there's people you get on the list. You might finally get your Section 8 voucher. They get their voucher, but they either can't get a landlord that wants to take it.
That's right.
Because landlords are nervous about and neighborhoods about low income people living among them sometimes, and but they're supposed to work for single family homes. The idea of Section 8 was, a lot of it was to put families with children into appropriate housing.
That's become an incredible bureaucracy. Was it you that I was talking to that somebody couldn't rent a house or something like that because that they only could rent a house with so many bathrooms or something like that? I guess that wasn't you, but they got incredible rules now. It must have been Marie that have incredible rules that put people. There's reasons for them, but as these reasons go through time, they become exclusionary.
Yeah.
And they actually exclude the people they were designed to help.
Right. Which is why the programs to build affordable housing are called inclusionary zoning. The idea behind that is to include some affordable housing. That's not just about the money. That's about families and kids being able to grow up among people who are not all poor. It's like in Chicago, you had everybody living in the housing projects.
Yeah.
That I thought we had also, as I said, as America as a whole, we want all kids to start out on a level playing field, having the same opportunities. And these housing issues are there's enough inequities in the schools and other aspects of life, but now these kids can't be in decent housing.
It's a good goal, but you just can't get everything for everybody. I mean, all the kids can't have perfect startups.
I don't expect them to, but I expect them to have those really basic opportunities. A safe place to live, healthy food to eat, a school to go to, someplace to go to when they get out of school if mom and dad are at work. Those are pretty basic needs. Pretty much every other developed country on the planet has those things worked out. We're the only ones who have set up this for-profit system for
and many of the undeveloped too as well.
Yes,
in fact,
absolutely.
some of the underdeveloped, less developed, I should say. Maybe not Brazil or India or some of the ones that are just about on the verge, but a lot of them have probably a more community orientation where it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes a country to screw one up apparently, because a nation state, I should say, rather than a country. But the poorer countries, and they're still more grassroots, and they're still more on the level of. Maybe they're not tribes or clans or anything like that, but their country is designed in such a way that they still are in touch with one another. They don't spend their days walking around with a phone or on. I do it, but it still drives me nuts.
Everybody does it.
Everybody does it. Two people sitting side by side. So anyway, Bill's wanting to wrap this up because he's got stuff to do. And but before we do that, we want to mention a couple more names of organizations. It was Community Alliance for tenants, tenants priced out, Stop Demolishing Portland, and then Margaret.
United Neighborhoods for Reform, UNR. Margaret Davis, she's awesome.
All right,
she testified at City Council today, so if anybody wants to watch that.
All right, that's on Stop Demolishing Portland site.
She can come here.
She wants to.
We were going to, but it didn't work tonight.
Yeah, she was at City Hall today.
Oh,
speaking up for the people. So more power to her. And she's willing to. Frankly, I'm more of a mind to not go and join a lot of city committees and things like that. I've been there, done that. But Margaret is there all the time, trying to do what she can to influence policy.
And getting tied in knots.
Yeah.
So.
But she does it.
All right. Well, I appreciate you showing up, and we had a good discussion. Anything we missed you want to bring up? We'll have plenty of time in the future, too, as well.
Yeah, well, I like the idea of continuing discussions about this. It's a huge issue, and it encompasses so many different things and so many different people. I'd like to make sure we're representing everybody as we discuss it. Sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, I picked a video out of the hat here. This is a little over an hour. It's a really good one. If you love if you love nature and you love the environment, this is going to kind of plug you into what's going on that sometimes you just don't see living in the city. So. We'll be back in a while, long while.
You are watching the Independent Producers Organization program. This program replays on these channels, at these times, and on these days. Write it down and tell your friends.
West, particularly with our resident weather systems, rain is funneled into the Northwest region from the fall through the spring. And that rain comes as rain, but also as mist and a lot of fog. And as that fog moves through the millions of needles of our conifer forests, that fog is actually captured by the texture of those needles and drops as rain. Here we have a Doug fir branch that is collecting drops of rain out of the fog. For example, here in our Bull Run watershed in the Cascades east of Portland, about a third of the rainfall is attributable to needle drip. If there were no conifers there, rainfall would decrease by about a third. In the coastal strip, what you've got is easily half of the rainfall is attributable to needle drip, and that would be the Sitka spruce forests in the coastal strip further north, and the redwood forests further south. And in fact, in Northern California, you can pretty much map where the fog goes on a routine basis by looking at the distribution of the coast redwood tree. And they go way, way inland in some of the valleys where there's a lot of fog and needle drip. If you basically look at a plot where mean annual temperature from minus freezing at 0 Celsius up to 30, which is quite warm, on from 39 to 157 inches of rainfall. At the very low end of rainfall, we've got deserts where basically evaporation exceeds precipitation. In an intermediate zone of ecosystems in terms of temperature and rainfall, we have grasslands, and of course they overlap with both deserts and forests. Finally, this last array of blobs is all related, I shouldn't say all, is mainly related to forested ecosystems. You'll notice they go out into much higher levels of rainfall, particularly the tropical forests, very high rainfall required at the higher temperatures. And you've got overlap among these, and the deciduous conifer distinction is not only a matter of amount of rainfall, but its timing. And then finally, we have the Arctic and alpine tundra down here at the extremely cold levels, where basically it amounts to a desert type condition because living things require liquid water. And if it's frozen, it doesn't do particularly plants any good at all. Actually, if you take a transect across the United States at the 39th parallel, you'll see that the air masses coming in from the west deposit a lot of rainfall on both the coastal mountains and up here in Oregon in the Cascades. You've got a dry rain shadow to the east. The Rockies get a mix of moisture coming in from the west and up from the Gulf. Again, the rain shadow with dry land. And then finally, as you get into the East Coast, you'll notice there's a contrast. We've got conifers here in the west, and in the east, we've got dominant deciduous forests. And that's basically due to the distribution or timing of the rainfall throughout the year. Fundamentally, deciduous trees require summer water. And in the absence of summer water, they get outcompeted by conifers. And so here in the west and down into California, as well as up here in the Pacific Northwest, that long summer drought is what biases our forests toward conifers. Here we have Detroit, Oregon's rainfall just over the ridge of the mountain from the Opal Creek area. And you'll notice major rainfall, well, actually beginning in the fall. September, particularly November and December, very high. January, February, dropping off a bit in the spring. And finally, June, low, but July and August, these extremely low levels of rainfall basically mean that deciduous trees in the Cascades live in places where there's water from some other source. A stream bringing water in, a lake, a wetland, or something of that sort. Because the deciduous trees can't really get through this long dry period effectively. By contrast, by the time you're in the Midwest or on the East Coast, look at the distribution of rainfall. The summer months are peak rainfall, and that's mainly as summer thunderstorms. And that high level of rainfall then gives a competitive advantage to the deciduous trees. And in the Midwest and the East, we have deciduous forest dominating, such as this is actually a true white birch in Minnesota. Here in Oregon, compounding things as well, we have the crest of the Cascades. Here I'm standing on South Sister and Middle and North Sister out here. The clouds pile up to the west and deposit enormously more rain. That gives us our Douglas fir and hemlock dominated forests on the west side. And by the time you get to the rain shadow on the east side, you end up with ponderosa pine. And I'll be contrasting those forests later. Now, in addition to rainfall and a good quantity of it, another thing that trees need to grow at any kind of reasonable size is soil. This natural bonsai is a Jeffrey pine that grew on Sentinel Dome for over 900 years, and it's only 30 feet tall. And you can, in fact, well, once you get up here, if you stand right here, you can literally put your arms around it. It's not all that big. And basically, soil ends up being a really fundamental source to support a forest ecosystem. And you require not only a reasonable depth and amount of soil, but you require a really substantial array of ecological processes going on in that soil to support a forest. And when I'm talking about biodiversity, I'll be talking about that in a little more detail. Now finally, another major feature of our environment that shapes our forest ecosystems is fire. Fire has been a natural part of the ecology of forests, and trees have evolved to cope with fire in a whole variety of ways. Some resist it, some just reproduce afterwards and die from it. But fire and its timing and intervals are powerful forces that affect our forests. And I think there's a really important misconception about fire that is widely kind of promulgated by people saying this fire covered this many thousands of acres, and then they show you pictures of the huge flames like we just saw, and then they show you pictures of destruction like this. And yeah, the forest as we know it has been changed, but I don't really view it as destruction. But you get pictures like this of where the fire's gone and they tell you it covered these many thousands of acres. In reality, typically, your typical fire will actually only burn about half the area inside the fire lines. Even in that very intense Yellowstone fire where the wood on the forest floor was so dry that it was drier than the kiln-dried lumber you'd find in your local lumber yard. The fire burned day and night. In Yellowstone, believe it or not, the fires of '89, literally the fire lines covered half the area of Yellowstone National Park. Okay? And then, so according to my very, very kind of seat of the pants, rough cut model, that would mean that a quarter of the park saw some fire. And half of that would have been crown burn. So half of a quarter is an eighth, which is 12.5%. When they looked at the aerial photographs of the park after the fire, between 15 and 16% had crown burned, even under those extraordinary and severe conditions. So this kind of thing is really only a very small part of the total landscape. Much of the fire escapes being burned. This is up in the Quinault area, and it's a research natural area. You can see a lighter green here. This is an area that burned over 100 years ago. The more scraggly bluish greens here are old growth. This area did burn, and you can see it's lighter. And of course, this is no longer current forest because it's tree plantations. It's a clear cut. And if you look at old growth, like in this area here, this is what you see. Just magnificent, huge trees, nice abundant foliage, yet these trees were in the line of fire between 100 and 200 years ago when the major fires in this area last burned. In Westside forests, fires are 1 to 200 year intervals, very long intervals. And one of the major things that Douglas fir trees do is basically resist being burned or resist being killed or dying because of a fire. One of the things that helps over here on the right is the fact that because of shading and other factors, and even past fires, the lowest branches die, and these first branches up in this Douglas fir are commonly 120 to 170 feet up in the air. Makes it very hard for a fire to ignite the crown of this old growth tree. Douglas firs also have very, very thick bark. Somebody cut into this Douglas fir tree in the 1989 it burned in the 1989 silver fire. Somebody cut into it subsequent to the fire. The tree literally was in flames on its surface. The bark is charred quite deeply. But yet, I came by about a year later, and they cut into the cambium, the living layer between the bark and the interior wood of the tree, and you can see the tree working to heal this wound that was cut into it. This cambium is fully alive right here. That's alive. It's beginning to heal this wound. And so, although the tree was literally in flames, it survived just fine. And as a matter of fact, there was a lot of controversy over what the Forest Service defined as a dead tree from that fire. They went in and salvage logged large numbers of, quote, defined dead trees. And I actually went in as they logged and looked at the stumps. And in fact, because it took them a number of years to actually log these officially dead trees, they had actually grown more in the last 3 years than in the last decade. They were very much alive. They'd lost a lot of their crown, but they still had enough foliage to keep going. And the key, of course, is that they had no competition for water because the fire cleared the ground for them. The fire released a lot of nutrient, which helped the trees. And so the fire actually is an important natural part of the ecology of these forest ecosystems. And we particularly try to eliminate it at our peril. There's a lot of evidence of fire. Here's a western red cedar. Because of their thin bark, it very easily kills that cambium layer, as occurred here. And the tree actually was burned earlier and started to heal in this area. Well, actually, let's go over here. Here's the first fire. It worked to heal. The fire, a second fire came through and killed this healing part of the tree. And here we have a wound healing process occurring in the present time. And basically, the tree keeps growing out where it's alive, and then the edge grows in. And so it grows like that until finally those edges will meet, squeeze out the bark, and seal the tree off and make it whole around its entire outer perimeter. So, right here, this tree is working to heal this earlier fire scar and its wound as well. Here's actually a cedar that fell down that I cut off and could actually sand the core off of. You can see the tree grew very rapidly. A lot of it was apparently killed in the fire. You've got a fire scar right here. Really slow growth right after it, but you can see the tree working to heal, and this would ultimately come around if the tree had managed to live long enough. Here is a log, or basically a chunk of a tree that was laying on the ground from some trail work. You can see where the edges have met, begun to squeeze out the bark, and you've got charred wood back in here that have been healed over. So trees In this case, this is a hemlock. That earlier one was a western red cedar. Both have thin bark and are fairly easily fire scarred by the heat of a fire in a local place. Another solution trees have to evading being killed or eliminated by fire are the serotinous cones. And that's another major category of fire adaptation. Instead of resisting the fire, the tree ends up not evolving the adaptations to avoid being killed by the fire, but instead an adaptation to seed back in new trees after the territory has been cleared by a fire. Serotinous cones are particularly developed by knobcone pine in the southwestern part of Oregon and by lodgepole pines on a much broader scale throughout the Northwest and out into the Rockies. These serotinous cones, in fact, I should go back. The serotinous cones are sealed by wax that basically keeps the cone from opening up and releasing seeds until it's exposed to the heat of a fire. And after the fire melts that waxy material, the cones open up, reseed the ground with new seeds and trees, and the parents can replace themselves. So rather than resisting the fire, they just take advantage of it as a reproductive event. I probably should include one more shot here, but literally the ground can be covered by thousands of trees per acre, such as happened in Yellowstone after their fire. It's just absolutely thick with lodgepole pine trees. Now, kind of a variation on this theme is our east side fires. When you get down into the rainfalls that are 30 inches and below, east of the Cascades, you end up with ponderosa pine trees being the dominant forest tree. Ponderosa pine trees survive at these and do well at these lower water levels, but they do it in a very dispersed kind of way. And the thing that helps keep them dispersed is the fact that the big trees resist fire, and this low-level ground burn, which is common to the east side, burns the ground. It's carried by grass, carried by the needles that are underneath the tree, and with the frequent fires that occur with lightning and so forth on the east side, little tiny ponderosa pine trees get thinned out. Basically, the grass carries the fire, and particularly the needles under the trees carry the fire. And because the needles under the trees carries the fire, the trees don't grow competing trees under them as long as they're alive and shedding needles. When they die, they get replaced because fire doesn't burn there. So it's really an amazingly elegant system where fire thins the forest naturally and leaves you with nice, widely dispersed stands of ponderosa pine. Just, I get chills as I even think and talk about it. It's so amazing and neat. And in fact, if you look back at the 1937 survey of H.J. Andrews, after whom the H.J. Andrews Forest east of Eugene is named, these are square mile sections. And obviously, fire moved through this area. And you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 square miles, but look at the minute portion of these 4 square miles that actually was crown burn. Those little tiny red patches, that's all. Yet you have ponderosa pine forest through most of that area. Now, in a more west side scenario, a much higher percentage of that landscape would have burned. But instead, ground burn occurred broadly in that area, but it didn't get into the canopy. And of course, let me just quickly go into some of the things we're doing to fire now. Grazing on the east side eliminates the grass that carries fire. This area has been grazed. This is actually a line laid by a drip torch during some experimental burning that was done on the Umatilla National Forest. No, it was the Walla-Whitman National Forest. And what you've got here is a line where the fire was dropped, drip, 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 burning drips of combination of diesel fuel and gasoline, and it burned just a little bit, but didn't get anywhere. Where it went through the conifer needles from these ponderosa pines, it did burn out that whole area. But the cattle grazing inhibits that normal spread of fire. And between cattle grazing and suppression of fire that used to burn every 15 years or so, we've got this very unhealthy condition very broadly across the Eastside forest landscape. Those young trees are no longer snuffed out. They have now begun to grow. And with these many young trees under the big trees, you've got way too much competition for water and an inability of those big trees to resist bark beetle invasions. And you also, if you get fire in here, these torch and will take out the big trees. As a consequence, instead of those tiny patches that we saw in that H.J. Andrews map back in 1937, here's a more recent east side burn. And look at the relatively high percentage of the landscape where the crowns of the trees have burned. And that basically is largely a result of the incredible energy we put into suppressing fires since 1910. In 1910, there was a major set of fires that inspired everybody working on forest management to basically stop fire in its tracks, ideally by the next day. And we've ended up really fundamentally deranging the ecology of forests that have frequent fire. Now, mind you, these fires do get hot. Here is the remains of a cook set from a friend who was camping out in the area burned by the Silver Fire. The aluminum melted quite completely. Here's an area of the experimental burn. You know, very fortunately, we were all in Nomax and could stand in a wet meadow, nearly a wetland, and watch this area that got pushed just a little bit too hard. And fire's positive feedback. The more it burns and the hotter it gets, the more it can burn. And this patch, they ran too many fire lines through too quickly and too close and accidentally precipitated such an intense burn that it literally cooked the sap in all the living trees, which should have been able to survive a fire. And literally the next day, the trees were split open, the sap had boiled out of them. And the sound of the fire at this intensity was very much like a jet airplane, a jet engine. The roar was just incredible. Yet, in that very place where I took that picture, a month later, here's a Mariposa lily blooming. Soil is amazingly insulating and protects like the bulbs of this lily. It protects ants, it protects small rodents, all of which contribute to the ecology of the forest after the fire. And in particular, the rodents protected underground from the heat of the fire will have fungal spores in their guts. And even though the forest soil surface may be sterilized, those rodents will, as they defecate going through the forest after the fire, they re-inoculate the forest with the fungi that it needs to keep the forest ecosystem going. Similarly, in an area that was burned, a whole variety of wildflowers comes up, a nice composite with a fritillary butterfly on it. In broader areas of burn, the fireweed comes up and provides just incredible broad displays. That last one's actually in an area after the Yellowstone fire. So we've got water and a minimum amount and its distribution profoundly affecting what kind of forest ecosystem we have. We have soil, and particularly the complex ecology of soil, which I'll go into in the next minutes. And we have fire. These are really three dominant major shaping influences on the forests we have in this region. Just a quick look at species diversity, which I'm going to be focusing on in the next part of this talk. And here we've got a disturbance like fire. And what we're looking at is two categories of species. The early successional species that need a lot of sunlight and can reproduce rapidly and often have floating seeds and that kind of thing. Small, rapidly reproducing, both plants and animals, the rodents included for animals. They come in very quickly, but then you'll notice, interestingly, at the point the canopy closes, they drop way, way down because there's now very little light and cover on the forest floor. And instead, the late successional species, the species that are capable of getting bigger and grabbing the sunlight first, end up dominating. And the interesting thing is that by the time you get to well along, and by the way, in terms of real time, herbs invade in the first decades. The seedlings and trees begin invading late in that decade. The canopy closes at 30 to 50 years particularly, maybe a little longer, but 30 to 50 would be a reasonable time frame. The full closed canopy is at the first century, on out to 200-300 years. The mature trees begin dying and opening up the canopy, and then you get the old growth conditions where there's now enough light on the forest floor that those early successional species come back. And the aggregate of diversity of those early successional species that come back, plus the late, gives you a particularly outstanding level of biodiversity in our old growth forests. And so these old growth forests that we have here in the Northwest that are, 3 to 5 or 800 years old, are utterly phenomenal reservoirs of biodiversity. Interestingly, if you look at mammals, the story isn't quite the same. And that is actually the highest diversity for mammals ends up being very early in an early successional ecosystem. So having some diversity across the landscape is important to mammalian diversity. When the canopy closes and you've got very little cover and very little living vegetation on the forest floor, in that young forest, mammalian diversity really troughs severely. And again, as you get more ground level plants going in your older forest, mammalian diversity comes back. In developing a forested ecosystem, a particularly important pioneering tree species is the red alder, Ulmus rubra. And red alder grows especially well on disturbed sites. It'll grow even in the really tough, difficult conditions that you'll find on an old roadbed. And partially it's because red alder actually forms nodules on its roots. And those nodules create the anaerobic environment that nitrogen-fixing bacteria require. So red alder is a major kind of bootstrapping influence on a forest ecosystem, raising nitrogen levels in the soil so that the forest can grow more effectively. Interestingly, you've got, in among the red alder, you've got Douglas fir really coming up rather beautifully here. People say, well, you need a clear cut to get Doug fir to grow well. Well, here it's growing beautifully in among the shade of these alder trees and profiting from the nitrogen those alders have been putting into the soil. Ultimately, alder is a fairly limited stature tree, and the Douglas firs ultimately overtop it, as we see here. I couldn't resist at least throwing in this little picture of Ochrolechia on a red alder tree. It's called pumpkin pie lichen because it looks a little bit like a pumpkin pie. And it's a lovely little lichen. This is actually the fungal fruiting body for this crust lichen that covers red alder. And it's what makes our red alders almost look like a white birch. I mean, they are almost white enough to be a white birch. Here's a mid-successional forest. The canopy's closing. And if we go into a mid-successional forest where the canopy is closed and look at the ground, we'll see logs that were from the dead trees killed by the fire that established this forest 100 to 200 years earlier. In this case, the main fire that established this forest was about 160 years ago. And you've got very little higher plant vegetation on the forest floor. It's just mosses, things that can live in very dim light. Here's another mid-successional forest. A little bit further along, the canopy has opened up just a little bit more. You still got mainly moss, but you're beginning to get a few higher plants on the forest floor. Ultimately, out there at 200 to 300 years, you'll end up with an old growth forest. And old growth forests have kind of a well-defined array of characteristics. The biggest one, or the major one, of course, and the obvious one being big old trees. 300 to 500 or more year old trees are big and typically quite old. Since the trees will have varying ages, the canopy is multi-layered. Trees of many, many different heights. The younger trees are obviously shorter stature, and then the big old trees. Now, in addition to those living features, there will be standing dead trees, or snags. And these are important structural features in terms of habitat, and they can actually last in the forest for centuries after a fire event. So you can have a tree that's killed remain standing in the forest for another 200 plus years, 200 or 300 years. And then finally, and here's the really fun one. In fact, I got to tell a fun story on Jerry Franklin, who's just a premier forest researcher and expert on our forest ecosystems in this region. Jerry Franklin was part of the initial descriptor paper for old growth forest characteristics. These 3 characteristics were recognized. Their 4th characteristic was dead trees in streams. And I happened to have just read that paper the day before seeing Jerry Franklin at a conference, and asked him why it was dead trees in streams when, now the standard for parameters are downed logs, big down dead trees, like these, right? And Jerry, in his inimitable, humble, beautiful way, slapped his leg and said, shucks, it's amazing. We were in those forests trying to figure out what to find in old growth forests. We were climbing over and under and walking along these things for hundreds of feet because they're wonderful superhighways, and we missed them. We just flat out, they were just like the air we were breathing. We didn't notice. It's kind of a neat insight into how even a great scientist and a phenomenal observer like Jerry Franklin can end up missing an important thing along the way. But that's the way science advances, and ultimately down logs were added to those defining characteristics. Western red cedar, here's some nice big old growth western red cedar up in the research natural area in the Lewis River area in Washington. Some more western red cedar. Really beautiful giant trees. In the Opal Creek drainage, there are a pair up on Cedar Flat that are in the range of 600 years old and 6 feet in diameter. Here is a Douglas fir, and it's actually Mark Hatfield and Peter Schoonmaker. We ran my 30-inch core into the tree for Mark Hatfield's benefit. And here's a tree that is just under 500 years old. But it's not all that big. And in the Opal Creek area, the trees are relatively smaller for their age because the nitrogen levels in the area are lower because of the lack of imported nitrogen from salmon. In broad areas of our forest ecosystem, salmon bring really significant amounts of nitrogen in and help the forest ecosystem to grow more rapidly. This is an area known as the Franklin Grove in the Opal Creek drainage. Some really giant old growth tree, and we're going to kind of focus on this tree and step back out. So there's that same tree, and we're going to come in at the base and actually scan all the way up to the top. Now, up in that canopy, a lot of really important activities occurring. The berry thrush likes to live up there. The top of the tree will have moss-covered branches that literally will have humus form under that moss, and you literally end up with soil ecology going on under those moss pads, more than 100 feet above the ground. In addition, you'll have caterpillars of butterflies and moths eating their way through the conifer needles. There will be countless species of lichen, including this hypogymnia or bone lichen. It's again a canopy lichen, but you'll find it falling out of the trees on the ground. And up in the canopy, a particularly outstanding lichen growing in a zone that is below the very driest tops of the trees. So it's deep enough into the canopy that it stays moist a good part of the time, okay? But yet not so deep in the canopy that it's too shaded. This is the lichen known as Loberia oregana, Oregon lungwort. It, in an old growth forest, is the major source of fixed nitrogen that fertilizes the forest. So literally, our old growth forests maintain fertilizer factories in the canopy, in their treetops, that help support that basic lack of nitrogen that our forest ecosystems have. So Loberia, and this also called lettuce leaf lichen, it's an amazing combination. This is the fruiting body of fungus, roughly equivalent to a toadstool or a mushroom on the forest floor. So the body of this lichen is fungus. The green layer we see here on the top is actually a layer of green algae that is right under that top surface layer. I should actually have included a picture of the bottom side. It's white because there's enough fungus underneath that you can't see the algae. And then you'll notice little tiny black dots. In fact, let's go back. See these black dots? Those black dots are actually colonies of a cyanolichen, or cyanobacterium, that fixes nitrogen from the air. And so this three-way team, this collaboration, is really fundamental to maintaining the flow of nitrogen through our forest ecosystems. And this collaboration raises, to me, a really, really fundamental point that people miss, and we'll run into it again and again. And that is that people often think about Darwinian evolution as being survival of the fittest, truth and claw, wipe out the other guy, win at all costs, but mainly get rid of everything else. In reality, survival of the fittest in a forest ecosystem very often means not killing off, but collaborating. Collaboration and teamwork end up trumping in a huge array of cases. And in fact, the whole forest is ultimately dependent on collaboration, not fundamentally competition. And this lichen, lungwort, is certainly a beautiful example of it. Another neat canopy lichen is old man's beard, Alectoria, that just hangs from branches in an old growth canopy tree. That's kind of looking at the top of old growth trees. This low angle view of the sunlight coming into the North Fork Valley near Opal Creek gives you some sense of the multi-layered canopy. I'm up on the slope looking out into the forest top, and you'll see trees of many, many different heights. And that multi-layered canopy is fundamental to letting light in to the lower levels of the forest. The branches contain many, many kinds of mosses in addition to the lichens. Mosses are important to the forest because they absorb water and then evaporate the water to keep humidity up. And if the humidity's up, the pores in the needles can open up and let in carbon dioxide so the tree can do photosynthesis. When it gets too dry, trees have a hard time doing it. So interestingly, all that moss on all those tree branches helps that the trees are holding up there, helps keep the humidity higher so the trees can photosynthesize longer and grow better. So the moss helps the forest. Here's actually a really very, very rare lichen. Its common name is old growth specklebelly. It's a fun name. Anybody want to try to pronounce that one? Pseudocyphalaria, rainierensis, yeah. And actually, I think some of you bark people have learned about this lichen and used it to help protect areas of old growth because it's a rare enough lichen that protecting it ends up being important in relation to limiting logging. Another Loberia pulmonaria is also a three-way collaboration. Countless beautiful lichens on the tree trunks. Sporophorus is a lichen that grows on lower levels on tree trunks. It's also called Christmas tree lichen. You've got these little bulbous ends that look like Christmas ornaments. Little close-up view of a Douglas fir tree, focusing on it because it's a really fundamental structural feature of our forests. Here we've got Doug fir pine cones. Pine cones, listen to that. I keep doing it. It's remarkably common. It's a fir cone. It's not a pine cone, but that's all right. But these guys look a little like mice that have taken a dive under the scales. You've got the two hind legs going back and the tail. That little bract on a Doug fir cone is a signature for this species. The needles are very much like a bottle brush. They come out on essentially all sides, a little sparser on the bottom, but single, a little bit blunt on all sides. Interestingly, Doug fir trees or Douglas fir trees are extraordinarily important for our forest ecosystems. As they grow and develop and get bigger, they become more and more significant. You've got this huge period of very high significance, which actually could even be flattened out a little more with your big live tree in the canopy of forest for centuries. The tree will die, and it can literally take another many centuries for it to decay in place, become a standing snag, and finally a downed log. And here we have kind of three photographs of those major life stages for Douglas fir. Here's a mid-successional fir, really vital and actively growing tip, putting on several feet of growth a year and a really good site. Here's a tree that is beginning to decline. This tree is easily 500 plus years old. It's got a dead top. It still has living branches on it. It's still putting on a tiny bit of growth every year. And in the Opal Creek drainage, it's unusually big. It's 8 feet in diameter and still going. Now, mind you, the outer rings in this tree are probably, it's taking 50 to 80 years to put an inch of new wood on the perimeter of this tree. It's growing extremely slowly. In a really wonderful, deep-soiled, water available all year Coast Range site, I've cored or actually looked at the stump of a 8-foot diameter Douglas fir that was salvage logged, 8 feet in diameter. At the edge, out at 8 feet in diameter, there were only 5 rings in an inch. It was putting almost a quarter of an inch of wood around the outside of that tree that's 8 feet in diameter and would have been several hundred feet tall. And it, of course, needed salvage logging, right? It was, I'm sorry, I get a little upset over that one. And then finally, as the tree declines, it can become a snag or fall and become a downed log. All of these important structural features of an old-growth forest ecosystem. Now, the thing that brings down most Douglas fir trees is this fungus, common name velvet top, Phallus schweinetzii. This fungus will get in through a wound in the root and then begin to rot the root and work its way into the heartwood, the center of the tree. And actually, if you look in the forest carefully, you'll see trees that are swelled at the bottom and then pinch in up there 10, 20 feet. And that's because the bottom of the tree has been weakened by this fungus. And it's growing extra fast to try to maintain its strength and stay up. Here's the top of an old growth tree, but this is a nearly 8-foot diameter Douglas fir. The heart, all brown cubic rot from Phallus, from the velvet top fungus. And it's only got about 8 inches of wood on its outer edge, but it's 8 feet in diameter. And that little bit of wood held the tree. Here's a tree that was only about 3 feet in diameter, and you literally only have about 1 3/4 inches of good wood on the outside of that tree. And finally, the snow load in one winter took it down. The heartwood, again, rotted by that fungus. A lot of trees stay standing, again, for centuries as dead snags. They will lose all their bark. They lose their fine branches. And here's one losing its bark. Once they've lost the bark, they'll actually rot a little more slowly if a fire chars their outer surface. Here's the top of a snag. And looking down it, here we have another much older snag acting as a nurse location for some hemlock trees. And here again, up in that western red cedar natural area in Washington in the Lewis drainage, we have some stumps and snags with hemlock trees growing out of them and taking root in those locations. While I'm focusing on the needles and the tops of the trees, there are fungi in the needles that actually help protect the needles from being eaten by insects that make them less palatable and digestible. And then, of course, there are fungi in the roots, the mycorrhizal fungi, which I'll talk about in a moment. And switching now from the snags, and we've got a nice snag there, to downed logs, and that's my friend and colleague, John Villela, with whom I've taught at Opal Creek now for more than 15 years. Looking at the forest floor, the snags and even living trees fall and become down logs on the forest floor, where they remain part of the forest ecosystem for centuries. And here we have an area of forest floor in the Opal Creek area, and these downed logs routinely become nurse logs, particularly for hemlock trees. Here we have a very recent downed log. At the point I took this photograph, it had only been down for a year, but yet in that year there were already little young western hemlock seedlings sprouting and beginning to grow. Hemlock grows in a basic woody environment, the woody forest floor, the wood of downed logs, and they fairly quickly become larger and still larger. And finally, these hemlock trees, this one here is about 150 years old at this point. It started in the tree, but now in the down log, but now roots have gotten out into the soil, and then the trees really can begin to grow faster. The ecology of down logs is extremely complex and fascinating. You've got countless kinds of mosses. This actually is red huckleberry. This is actually a fungus that is Lichen omphalina, which is in the very, very most primitive stages of becoming a lichen. The fungal hyphae, you can see these glistening bumps back here. Those are clumps of algae surrounded by the fungal hyphae, and the fungus is getting fed carbohydrate by that algae. So it's the beginning of a lichen kind of relationship. Mycena is a small wood decomposing cap fungus. These guys are about 1/8 of an inch in diameter. Here's a 1/2 inch scale from some hemlock needles. And then, down inside the log and down inside the soil in the forest floor, especially if it gets a little dry where you can see the fine fungal hyphae more easily, these are the hyphae, the actual feeding and active portions of fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi permeate the soil, huge amounts of fungus per cubic, whatever you want to measure, in forest soil. And those mycorrhizal fungi are actually getting fed carbohydrate by the trees, and the fungus in turn is bringing water and nutrient into the tree. And that mycorrhizal fungal relationship is fundamental to supporting our really big old growth trees. Without it, the trees can hardly grow. The rotting wood, witch's butter, here being fed on by a slug. Here is a small twig being decomposed by a toothed jelly fungus. This is only about 1/4 of an inch long in terms of real life. Amazing array of fungi on the forest floor. Cortinaria, the whole genus, wonderful different purple colors, characteristic veil and dark fungal spores. Honey mushroom, armillaria, nice edible. Another one, angel wings, Pleurotus. This one essentially only grows on hemlock logs, but just lovely, delicate structures. A given down log may have 10, 15, 20 or more kinds of moss on the log. And here's Trachybrium. It's a very robust very robust moss with kind of light tips. But the preeminent, dominant moss on the forest floor tends to be steppe moss, where it gets going. It basically gets ahead of all the other mosses by popping up this stem and growing a fan of new foliage each year. And here's the current year's growth. Here's last year's. Here's the years before. And you can actually dig out one of these and find the thing going back 10, 15, even 20 years. Down logs, as they decay, the sapwood is the most nutrient rich and decays first. So you end up with these caverns between the bark and the interior wood of the tree. That provides a marvelous environment for a lot of activities on the forest floor. Centipedes rove around inside there where they act as predators. Millipedes chew on things because they process living and dead plant material. They're not predators like the centipedes. Here is a fungus-eating true bug that moves around in that space and has a really long proboscis that it rakes in fungal hyphae and eats. And then finally, you've got a whole variety of holes. You know, I'm highlighting this one here, but these various holes are created by beetle larvae. You see they're kind of real size, and there's a closer look at it. It's Pterosticus is the genus. It's got a really fun common name, the Herculean groove-winged ground beetle. How's that for a nice one? And then this is beetle frass. The excrement of the beetle is left behind it. It's been chewed up, is being digested, at least partially. Other things come in and crawl through that, including termites and also worms. Here we've got a dampwood termite, also down inside that down log. Meanwhile, out on the surface, the huge amount of dead material that lands on the forest floor, including the surface of the downed log, is chewed through by the cyanide millipede, Harpaphe. This critter it has cyanide in it that it collects. It can squirt it out when it's been disturbed. It smells like almonds if you disturb it much. But it warns of its poisonous nature with all these yellow spots. So presumably predators, once they've encountered it and had trouble, will evade it. And here's a really fun one. By the way, I am using Keynote, a PowerPoint program, to create these various effects, something you can't manage in PowerPoint. And so here we've got Harpaphe down in its location on the forest floor where it is chewing on those conifer needles. The base of snags often collects piles of material that drop off the tree, bark as well as chunks of wood. And those chunks of material on that floor at the base of a snag provides marvelous moist and hiding places for a variety of amphibians, including Ensatina. Also great fungus habitat, great places for grouse to feed, snails. Here's a snail that really was extremely vulnerable. It took about 15 minutes to yank its house across this little branch. Really, I was tempted to help it, but I restrained myself. In the meantime, it of course was sticking its neck out hugely, because walking around on the forest floor, we have snail-eating beetles. Snail-eating beetles, I mean, I probably need to get a really good close-up of the jaws of these guys, but they have huge teeth on them, such that could grab a slimy thing and just crunch on it and cut it up. They eat snails. These guys only walk around, you notice I said walking around on the forest floor, in order to be more armored and protected against potential predators. These guys are actually so tough that shrews that try to eat them they pop out of their mouths. They can't. Because beetle wings normally can split down the middle, and those front wings come out and are kind of stationary and stabilizing, while the hind membrane wings let the beetle fly somewhat clumsily. This beetle gave up the ability to fly in order to be more armored against potential predators. That is a spot at the base of a hemlock tree in an old growth stand where deer truffles were being dug up by flying squirrels. Also on the forest floor, we have the rough-skinned newt walking along, and in this case I happened to catch one on a piece of lowberry that had blown out of the canopy. Pacific tree frogs, again, another predator on the forest floor. Countless herbaceous plants on the forest floor. The low Oregon grape is actually old growth associated, so that it lives in places for literally centuries in the context of an old growth forest. Another basically old growth species is Trillium ovatum, the white early spring trillium. It actually leaves behind a little bulb each year, and they persist for very long periods of time. And I've seen a research paper where literally 80 to 100 bulbs were there, a new bulb every year. So that trillium had been in the forest for nearly a century, which is, again, an old growth, just flowering plant. Again, a little reminder of just how complex and beautiful the forest floor can be in an old growth forest. Among the plants you can find there is the twin flower, Linnea borealis. Linnea is named after Linnaeus, who is actually the scientist who started the two-name system of keeping track of organism names. Twin flower, basically you can see the main stem up, this branch, and the two neat little bells hanging down. Countless absolutely fabulous plants on the forest floor. In moister places, the bog orchid, Habenaria, and in somewhat moist places as well. Fringe cup, again, a more midsummer flower, three-leaved anemone. Got a whole series of them here. Here's some beetles feeding on the nutrient-rich anthers where the pollen is located. And here's another one where the beetle is nibbling on the edge of a petal. Geum is again a plant where petal eaters have gotten at those, but here is a really nice, more perfect blossom. Another midsummer flower, late, is your western starflower. And here are actually the seed pods for fernleaf gold thread. These almost just look like, historic urns. Also on the forest floor, not only do we have lichens fixing nitrogen up in the canopy with lobaria, but frog pelt lichen in moister places also grows in good quantities. And again, anybody want to guess what all these neat little black bulges are? The cyanobacterium again. And that's the part of this lichen that fixes nitrogen. Lipstick lichen, one of the scale lichens. False lily of the valley. I'm sorry, what? That's not a flower. That's actually the fungal fruiting body. It's a rough equivalent to a mushroom because it's a lichen. And like the lichen I explained earlier, this is a body mainly of fungus. The green is algae. This, to my knowledge, doesn't use cyanobacterium. It's just a two-way collaboration. A dwarf dogwood, bunchberry, beautiful red berries in the fall. They're mainly seed, but they are somewhat edible. In the spring, they're pulling their chlorophyll out, and they kind of turn these wonderful colors in the spring. And here's the new foliage. And dogwood is actually an incredible array of roots underground. Like most of these forest plants, it grows by underground rhizomes, spreading underground as a clone, but then it makes seeds to help it spread to new locations. But in a given location, if it's at all favorable, it reproduces vegetatively, just like strawberries do, for example. Well, quick last look at the forest floor. And let's just take a moment and divert back up into the canopy, where northern spotted owls hang out on branches, keeping their eye and ears peeled for rodents moving around on the forest floor. And here is a red-backed vole, which lives on the forest floor, unlike the red tree vole, which lives in the canopy. And one more meal for the owl. So This is an area which does show a classic feature of old growth, which is a lot of more ground level vegetation because the canopy has opened up. And this is actually a LiDAR image, and it shows the relatively lower density of foliage up in the canopy because it's opened up in an old growth forest, and the relatively high density of things down on the forest floor. I'm going to skip that one. Here we've got particularly a vine maple and a lot of vanilla leaf and sword fern. Here is that mid-level intense vegetation in an old growth area up in the Opal Creek area where I've held so many classes. Here is the wonderful, just magnificent actually. I love the way maple leaves unfurl, especially vine maple. As that leaf unfurls in the spring, it's just kind of just a lovely, lovely silhouette. And then it spreads out and becomes part of the canopy. And of course, in the winter, those leaves are gone, but the branches are still there. And while I've got that winter slide up, I encountered this red fox up in Mount Rainier, and it graciously stayed around long enough to get a photo. Again, back to the forest floor and that intermediate level of foliage. Here's serviceberry, a shrub, low tree, beautiful flowers in the spring. Trailing blackberry, of course, this time of the season and later. Thimbleberry in moister places, and particularly in moist places, salmonberry. Again, it's a deciduous plant, and it particularly likes it where it's moisture near stream edges. Heather, heath, blueberry shots here, the oval-leaved blueberry. Just a lovely, lovely orange-shaped flower. Here's your red huckleberry flower. Not quite as lovely, but very interesting and neat. And then, of course, the rhododendron. All these closely related heathers and heaths actually make use of a very special kind of mycorrhizal fungi. Some support the trees, some support grasses, and some support these heathers and heaths. Here's a quick look at actually Battle Axe Creek and Opal Creek coming to make the Little North Fork. The Opal Creek Education Center is located there, where I've taught for decades now. And in the bottoms of river valleys, you have particularly good year-round water, so you can support more deciduous tree growth. Here's some nice alders growing. And the conifers take advantage of it too and just grow faster. Flowing underground well back from the stream, you have literally water flowing in what's known as the hyporheic zone that literally has organisms in it in a significant way. And you also, of course, have that surface water. Here's actually Opal Creek coming in. Opal Creek, like our old growth forest creeks, is magnificently clear water. This is easily 20 feet deep. Here is some more clear water, and here a shot underwater of the air bubbles being churned in to help keep that water just incredibly saturated with oxygen in this wonderful, clear, pure water. Very little nutrient in that water because the forest hangs onto it so effectively, but that cold, clear water is wonderful spawning habitat for our salmonids. This is a steelhead jumping in a Coast Range river. Here's a salmon working to make its red in the Wind River. And here is some upper reaches of a stream with its downed logs, which were actually initially identified as an old growth forest feature. The tailed frog is an indicator species for really cold, clear water. Basically, water much above 72 Fahrenheit kills them. So when you find tailed frogs, you know the water never gets hot. You don't even need to monitor the thermometer or the water with any kind of fancy device. Tailed frog tells you the water has always been good and cold all the time. And then here's a adult stonefly. The larvae live in the streams and are good food for fish. And here's one that has come out, and I caught it on the moss. Well, the fantastic biodiversity and complexity of these forest ecosystems is really amazing. You know, we were scheduled to actually eliminate all remaining old growth forests in this region by about 2020. Fortunately, in the 1980s and 90s, significant actions were taken to back off on the amount of logging. And I'd like to just quickly show you some of these impacts. One really interesting and amazing one is this shot out on the Umatilla National Forest. And if you look, well, here you can kind of see it, but notice that ribbon of silver going down that valley. I carefully had the pilot position the aircraft so I could get the sunlight to reflect off the water in that creek valley. So this in the fall, because you've got the bright yellow fall color of the larch, taken in September, still plenty of water in the stream being one of the headwater branches of Asotin Creek, with a number of threatened of threatened species of anadromous fish in it. Yet, clear cut right to the edge of the stream, slash burned over the entire area on the Umatilla National Forest. Actually, this one, we came dangerously close to publishing this in some way, side by side with the district manager and forest supervisor's pictures of the people responsible for doing this. In fact, I had a very interesting discussion with a senator's staff over this picture, because when I showed it to them, they looked at it and just shook their heads and said, "They never do that kind of thing in our national forests, do they?" Sorry. The problem is that when I'm doing this photo documentation, I've had, in this particular stage, I actually had my camera hooked up to a computer that logged each picture, and I have the GPS coordinates in an Excel database for where this picture was taken and what direction I was looking. So I could put a dot on the map where the plane was and an arrow showing where this picture was taken. It makes it kind of hard to say it wasn't deep within a national forest. Of course, all that logging accelerates runoff. This is the '96 flood down at the confluence of the Willamette and the Sandy Am. Landscape architects skillfully plan these clear cuts so that as you drive the Highway 26 east of Mount Hood, you don't see anything. Just this, you're driving through this magnificent continuous forest. You know, we were intensively logging this over many decades when private land cutting had to back off in the 70s because they were running out. National forest logging ramped up. And here we have big old growth Douglas fir falling into a clear cut. I mean, these are huge trees. Look at the size of the tree and these people. I don't have time here, but have had some amazing conversation with loggers over logging these trees. But Sam here, for example, really sees an appropriate end to old growth logging at the point I talked to him during this logging work. And also took it as a sacred trust and was phenomenally skillful in how he made sure that every one of those trees could land and not be broken up and be all good usable wood. But for many decades, you know, we've eliminated old growth forests and worked to convert them to tree plantations. This is a 40-year-old tree plantation around a Douglas fir stump. Of course, the biodiversity and magnificent complexity of an old growth forest are no longer here. This is actually a second generation clear cut. Here's the big old initial stump. Here's a log or a stump that was cut after about 100, just a little over 100 years of growth, and then here's the new seedling that's planted. So we've worked very hard to create plantations instead of the structural and biological and genetic diversity and complexity of our old growth forests. Fortunately, we have at least made significant progress toward appropriately husbanding and conserving that resource. Here's a more than 20-year-old clear cut on a ridge near the Opal Creek area. At higher elevations like 4,000 feet, cuts don't grow back well. Here's central Idaho cuts that basically in a decade period produce several 20-year floods, a 50-year flood and a 100-year flood. We mess up the hydrology when we clear cut too extensively. We've clear cut the boundaries of major natural areas like Mount Rainier National Park. And actually, because of that, even though this area is extensively clear cut, this is old growth forest reserve under the Northwest Forest Plan in an attempt to promote old growth forest development in an area here adjoining Mount Rainier National Park. By opening up the forest with clear cuts, this clear cut opened the forest to a major wind event, and the wind easily blew all these trees next to this ridge over. And here's a tree clutching a boulder as it went over. One of the challenges we have, of course, is we keep trying to get a lot of wood out of our forests, but as we go to higher and higher elevations, the trees are much smaller in diameter and much shorter. The volume of trees per acre is tiny, and so to keep the same amount of log coming out of our forests, we have to log incredibly higher acreages. That's a little hidden dimension of trying to maintain the cut. Some more high elevation cuts, and this is the Pistol River in southwestern Oregon. This is actually the state mandated tree protection buffer from these private cuts, pretty minimal. Here is a piece of the Shelton Sustained Yield Unit up next to Olympic National Park. This area was actually logged back in the 1960s. The site was treated so harshly that the mycorrhizal fungi were all killed off. It's a bacterial-dominated soil, and you can't get trees to grow here anymore. And here's some more of that kind of thing, and there's Mount Rainier National, again, the Olympic National Park, beyond it. Up in Alaska, giant Sitka spruce in places worthy, and this is a student's photograph, places worthy of national park type status, clear cut. Chris Mazer had a marvelous way of defining our IQ in relation to these kinds of things. We've solved a fair number of problems with science, but we create even more with our technology and with our political and economic systems. And the difference between those we've solved and the huge array of problems we've created is our IQ. And if you've read ahead, basically in this case, IQ doesn't mean intelligence, it means ignorance quotient. Jerry Franklin pioneered a system of logging that leaves more natural forest features behind, including down logs, as opposed to this 800-year-old stump in a classic hard-burn clear cut in the 70s. We've logged the edges of wilderness areas. You can literally define their areas from the air. The survival of juvenile spotted owls is very, very minimal. There's really no place to speak of to call home. We do have some significant areas protected. This is a trail that I teach from at Opal Creek. Here's some mid-successional forest at Opal Creek. A last look at a natural forested watershed. That is, I think, enough.
You are watching the Independent Producers Organization program. This program replays on these channels, at these times, and on these days. Write it down and tell your friends.
Yeah,
All right.
so we are.
Welcome back. We're discussing our playback times there. Well, show's just about over. We got exactly 5 minutes left now. So that's a pretty good conversation we had with Karen Crichton of the Stop Demolishing Portland. The demolition of homes and putting up those high-rise or whatever they call them, those pencil homes, is just one dimension of it. You know, there's so many dimensions of it with the fact that the builders and the contractors got the ear of the city council, but the people don't. And the fact that a few years ago the financial concerns got down to Salem and fixed it so they no longer have laws that you can only bump $60 a year for rent or whatever percentage it was something like that. And there's just so many things going on right now that make it difficult for people to get started in life, or people who are getting towards the end of their life, and have a very limited income and not much chance to make any extra money. They're pretty much stuck if they for some reason lose their home, or they get evicted because they were selling the home or demolishing the home. And it's so much of that going on. I know you, Richard, you own your home, so you're pretty well locked in there pretty well. You probably had it for years.
Yeah.
And so
the one we had for 35 years, right?
Wow. And so, you probably bought that thing 3 or 4 times by now.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and the cost of homes is just getting horrible. But I want to do a shout out to Karen Crichton and to of the Stop Demolishing Portland and Marie Lynn. God, I'm just spacing out her last name. It's a hyphenated name, and Lynn Claire of the group Tenants Priced Out. And she works really hard with these folks that are being evicted because they want to. Some of them are like $300-400 bumped rent.
Yeah,
and they just
never
can't
heard
do
of that.
And sometimes that's just to get people out of there so they can demolish it. Other times
Okay.
Other times it just gets sold. And then if you have a landlord that's a landlord, that's one thing. I mean, they sell it, it gets bumped up. But if it goes from property manager to property manager, and then that's heartless to heartless, in my opinion, and it just makes it that much more difficult to move along, and it's just going to keep getting worse. I mean, we're where San Francisco was just a few years ago, and I think our snowball effect is going to be quicker than it was in San Francisco. It seems to me that this urban growth boundary that's keeping things within a small area, which I think is a good idea. I don't want to see farmland turned over.
These cycles, though, they still go up and down. I remember, no sooner do you have everybody is too high, the rent's too high, then it goes to where it's low. Mm-hmm. It really is a cycle, and everybody gets into it while it's hot, and then there's so many, and then it cools off.
Yeah, or it's like they say, the bubble bursts, and then it's over with.
That's right, and that will happen.
It bursted. It's been 7 years now since it burst, and then I was just talking to a inspector for the house that I had to leave because they were selling it. He says that it looks like there's another one on its way, I guess because everything just escalates and gets so expensive so quick. The same thing, look at a plant or tree. It can grow so fast, so quick, that it'll fall over or branches will break because it doesn't have time to firm up the lignin in the bark and the tree itself. And the same thing happens, not the same thing, but similar. When we get too big too quick, it can't be sustained over a period of time.
Well, anyway, we want to thank the crew for doing everything to make this show possible.
That's right. We're down
Really?
to a little over a little under
hardly any time at all.
a time at all. That was a
it's,
quick 2 hours. Well, I want to thank the crew myself, and I hope folks enjoyed that PowerPoint presentation, Essential Ecologies. I've watched it a few times now. I'll probably watch it again. I learned a lot. I learned something every time I watch it. That last part on logging was terrible. Oh. But that's what we did to our forests. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next month. Possibly talk about the Cascade Media Convergence. So, bye for now.
Okay. All right.